Okay. I hope you can treat yourself. You know, I was kind of I did searching. I was on.
I'm sorry. Oh, when was that?
Like a second.
I feel like that's very
Good evening. Welcome to the UNC Division of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy 11th Mitchell Symposium. I'm Nancy Bagatelle and I'm the division director, and I'm thrilled that we're here together for our first Mitchell Symposium hybrid public talk. So we have a number of people joining us on Zoom, and after a 2-year hiatus, we have an in-person audience. So right here in Bondurant. So we're really excited to have people really all over the world joining us. Where's coming from? Okay. The Mitchell Symposium in Occupational Science is named in honor and memory of Dr. Marlis Mitchell, the founder of the master's program here at UNC, and her husband Earl, a great supporter of Marlis. Symposium scholars deliver a public lecture and participate in talks, discussions, and meetings with faculty, students, and researchers from throughout the division and the Department of Health Sciences. Initiated in 2011, the symposium has been made possible through generous gifts from friends and alumni of the division. Before I introduce our speaker, a few housekeeping items. For our attendees on Zoom, we ask that you remain muted during the presentation. At the conclusion of the talk, we'll have a little time for questions, and you can feel free to put your questions in the chat as we are going or at the end of the talk. If you're interested in receiving a certificate of attendance, we'll post the link at the end, and for those of you in attendance in person, you can copy that down. And for those of you in attendance, we will have a reception, so we hope that you'll stay and join us in the atrium of Bondurant on the ground floor. Okay, well, I'm excited to introduce our speaker, Dr. Gail Whiteford. Dr. Whiteford has been a contributor to occupational therapy and occupational science for more than 3 decades. She has served in clinical, managerial, academic, and consulting roles, including the Department of Foreign Affairs in Australia. Her contribution to the profession has been recognized through awards from international bodies, including the Canadian Association of Occupational Therapists and Occupational Therapy Australia. She has been a keynote speaker in 11 countries and was made the inaugural fellow of the Occupational Therapy Research Academy in 2017. She's published 4 books, many of which we are familiar with, and has over 100 referred publications. Dr. Whiteford's earliest publications relate to understanding occupation through time, multiculturalism, and globalism. Her justice focus, particularly in relation to occupational deprivation and enrichment, has also been present across the majority of her publications. These publications address a range of occupationally challenged populations, contexts, and occupational situations, including incarceration, refugees, Indigenous population, forced migration, and other extreme and oppressive conditions. At the same time, Dr. Whiteford has written prolifically about epistemology and ways of knowing that challenge traditional conceptualizations of occupation and context to further the theoretical underpinnings of occupation and justice. Dr. Whiteford is also a well-known educator and has been a mentor and very generous colleague to many occupational therapists around the world. Professionally, she has held a number of senior academic, executive, and conjoint appointments in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. And I could go on and on in terms of her contributions to the field of occupational therapy and occupational science. Currently, she leads an international team on the World Federation of Occupational Therapists Narratives Database Project, and she's going to be sharing some really exciting work that she's been doing. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Gail Whiteford. And let me change presentations.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Nancy, for that really warm welcome. And I'm also delighted to be here. I feel like I've been trying to get to Chapel Hill for a very long time. There's a bit of a backstory there I won't go into, but I've been wanting to come here for a long time because I'm going to be honest and say it's a school, a department that's well known for being independent in its orientation to scholarship, and in particular for having a critical perspective. So I'm really delighted to be here with colleagues, many of you new, some students, but also some familiar faces. And let's face it, to be doing anything face-to-face is so much more rewarding. I don't know about you guys, but I felt like I was on Zoom all day, every day, and it kind of, it got to me after a while. So face-to-face is irreplaceable. So there was that time in our recent history where if you listen to the media, the word unprecedented seemed to have been used an unprecedented number of times. I was growing a little weary day after day of the counts on, levels of infection rates, counterpointed against vaccination rates, and it was stuff that was coming at us endlessly in the media. I think I got to a point where I said to my husband, Harry, let's just turn the TV off. It was getting a bit much. And then there were the contexts that we went through. So I know you shared pretty well most of them here in this country. First of all, in Australia, we had a terrible drought, and there's kind of some ghosty noise in the background. I wonder if there's people online, never mind. And we had drought. I was personally affected by the drought. We have a property and we had to buy water in. And that gets scary when you have to buy water from someone. You're not sure if they're going to continue to have water, what will happen. So that was getting to us a bit, that we were having to buy water in the drought. The next thing that happened because of the really dry conditions is that we had wildfires. I think you call them here, we call them bushfires. And at one stage, the hill across from our place, I think I showed a slide to the students this morning of our farm across from us that was on fire. And the helicopters were drawing water from our neighbour below us from their dam to help extinguish the fires. But if the wind had changed, I might not be standing here, I'm not sure, but it was scary. And then, like all of us, then the pandemic came along, and I think it took us a while to realise just how that was going to play out. But it certainly deeply affected. All of our communities in Australia, we felt it. And Melbourne, one of our capital cities, had the longest lockdown in the world. They didn't manage it so well, but that's another story. And then the irony of having got through all of that, we had floods. So having had droughts and bushfires and to have floods seemed terrible. They did affect my town. We weren't so personally affected by the floods, but our neighbours lost part of their property. So all of this was what we would call challenging times. And there was a sense in which people felt flattened by it. As my brother said, we had the stuffing knocked out of us, with Australian terminology there, but it felt like that. However, something else was going on at that time when people were reporting feeling really flattened. And there's something else that was going on was the stories of agency with which people were responding to these challenging times. Word was filtering through of people doing wonderful things in their suburbs. I don't know if during COVID you had the teddy bear trail thing going on. Okay, in some cities, people were putting teddy bears in windows. So at least if you were out for a walk during lockdown, you could see where the teddy bears were going with your kids. Yeah, there was a sense in which people were responding in ways that showed agency and hope, even in the face of terrible, terrible conditions. So it seemed to me that this was too good an opportunity for us to waste, and that we needed to capture these narratives speaking to these responses. So this is where it all started. Being bold, and I was speaking to the students this morning about being bold and taking a risk, I put a proposal up to our peak body, Occupational Therapy Australia, and I suggested that it was a good time for us to try and capture these narratives of people doing remarkable things in difficult conditions, and that it wasn't a book that should be focused on any one of those challenging contexts. It wasn't to be a book about COVID. It wasn't to be a book about bushfires or floods. It was a project that would be about the occupational strategies that people used, what they did in response, and certainly not about resilience. I don't know about you, but I personally really don't like the word resilience. Anyone else share my aversion to resilience? Good, thank you. It's not just me. I did, because I don't know what resilience means. That's my objection to it. I don't know what resilience actually is. I would rather, as an occupational scientist, say, what did people do that then might have represented this thing called resilience? I really would rather reach behind this construct. It's a psychologized construct, good on them, but to me, it's not where the learning might be. So what was it that people actually did? Also, importantly, this project was about providing a vehicle for representation for people of the diverse voices that we don't always hear from. So this was everyday people doing everyday things through to extraordinary things, but not people that we're always focusing on, particularly at the level of the media. The way it was framed was that it was also a vehicle for us in the profession of occupational therapy to engage with different communities, for example, with our First Nations communities. And I'll talk about how that went in a minute. Importantly, and this is something that I do say a lot, and I'll keep saying it for perhaps another several years, is that it was an opportunity for us to show our domain of concern rather than tell what our domain of concern is about. Why do I say that? I've got to say, I think we've been through a period of adolescence, crisis of identity, where we kind of almost shrilly sometimes keep telling people what occupational therapy is over and over. And I would say it's about time we stand on our own, in our own epistemic ground, and actually show through the ontological perspectives of others, through the voices of other people, rather than keep telling people what we're about. And we might have a bit more of a discussion about that later on, but let's show, not keep telling people. It was a way to enact solidarity with very affected communities and say, we stand with you in illuminating your lived experiences and what you've been through. And importantly, I was speaking to the students this morning about hope, that this was a way to collectively reflect on what had happened and how people responded occupationally. And through that, capture a sense of hope of where we might get to and what we might learn from these experiences. So boldly, Occupational Therapy Australia said, yep, we're going to get behind it, and doing our best, individual and community responses to challenging times was born as a project. And I'd have to commend our association. Years ago, they wouldn't have seen this as being core business, and they would have been focused on a million other things that our professional bodies do. But they really understood what this was about and saw it as important and said, sure, we'll commit a budget to it. And, as you know, particularly faculty know, as soon as you've got a budget, you can do things. And we were away. They were very keen, as was I, that the team of people that might get together to make this happen was as diverse as possible. So, and also that it wasn't just me choosing my friends from around Australia, but rather that people had an opportunity to be involved. So we called for expressions of interest, and I said to OT Australia, I will sample and include people on the basis of the most diverse representation that we can. And we did that. It was a really diverse team of different people from very different backgrounds and representation. And as well as that being good practice, we also saw that that was an opportunity to have this kind of organic reach into the communities that people came from. We refined our purpose statement, the story structure. So we gave people a story structure to follow, which was, who are you? Where are you? What did you do? Either yourself or with others in the context. And then what came out of that, or where did you get to with it? 1,000 words. And importantly, we asked people to include an image or a photo where they wanted to, or that they felt comfortable with. And I'm so glad we did that, because the images that came in are really powerful. You're going to see some of them. And it's also about representation. I'm going to come to that at the end as well. Another thing we did, and I'm glad that we did it, was we set up a double-blind reviewing process. So a lot of people on the team I was working with, this was a really new idea, that we would double-blind review. So each time a story came in, we would send them to two people who would read them independently and then go, okay, against the criteria that we'd established, give it a score out of 20. That was to prevent us ever being criticised for just including the stories from friends, aunties, uncles, cousins, people that we knew, but really to include the ones that, again, spoke to diverse representation. We talked about style guidelines. We discussed the way in which the book was to be accessible. So we have an e-copy that's been accessible on different platforms and readers. And right now we're working on an audiobook version as well. And we appointed a graphic designer. I was really relieved to see that. In my lifetime, professionally, I've seen us do all sorts of cool things, but with really dodgy production values. So to have an actual graphic designer who we could discuss things like the size of the images and what images and how it should look, and the look and feel was just fabulous. And we called for contributions from around the country, and there it was, the book was born. So how did we do that? Well, in the most organic way possible, we told members of the profession to tell people that we're looking for stories, and here are the guidelines for how it might look. And we particularly stressed that it didn't need to be that people wrote stories. They could narrate them to someone else. They could use augmentative communication, whatever the vehicle was that people were comfortable with, they had the freedom to do that. And Of course, this is where, there's always a little bit of corporate interest. I've got to say that Occupational Therapy Australia has their colours are purple and orange. So that was kind of non-negotiable on the look and feel of the book, but I was okay with that because I got to work with the content. Importantly, we were committed from the outset to acknowledging First Nations communities and throughout the book. So I'll show you as we progress on, but the book opens with an acknowledgement of country, and there straight up we have the Aboriginal flag and the Torres Strait Islander flag, which are really our co-communities in Australia, and we would expect to see that represented. It was the way that we needed to start the book. Importantly, also, is that we had the book, and I really was very strong on this from the beginning, that the book was to be dedicated to Dr. Wilcock. Can you just nod if you know the work of Dr. Wilcock? Great, thank you. It makes me feel a lot better. Anne was so important as my doctoral supervisor, and I was her first student. And I was probably a handful, but we got to be very, very close colleagues and then friends. And I have the deepest respect for her work. We lost her, I think, a little early too. But she was a scholar of doing. And again, with the students this morning, we spoke about using the word doing. She had some big dreams and visions about how we might focus on doing in society. At one stage, she was trying to convince me that we should have a TV channel or a YouTube channel called Doing Well, which actually still is a possibility, but dedicated to the memory of a unique and original scholar, Dr. Wilcock. Something really interesting happened when we got these stories in and started reviewing them and reading through the content. And I did this with the team, but initially with Dr. Wicks, former doctoral student of mine. So we were on the same page in approaching the narratives. The stories naturally fell into these three groupings of doing with, and doing for, and almost an equal number in each category. So straight up, that told us something about what people had been doing and their motivations behind it and what it meant. And that was perhaps a little unexpected for us, but it gave us then the structure for the book that got us away from, these are stories about the fires, these are stories about the floods, these are stories about COVID, because that wasn't the point. Those contexts were important, but they weren't the point of the book. The point of the book was always the doing, right? So we were really delighted when we got this clear, well, some of them overlap a little, but a pretty clear distinction between the doings. So at the top of the page there, you'll see the map of Australia with Melbourne, or Woiwurrung, as we would know it in the local Indigenous language. And we did this, we worked this through in the research and the naming with input from different Aboriginal communities so that we would get it right. And the feedback we've had on that has been really positive. So that was an important acknowledgement of place and identity. I'm going to go through some of the stories here. I really wish that you could interact with all of them. I've got a copy here afterwards if people would like to look at it, please do. And also you can, it's not an ad, but you can buy this book. You can buy it in e-copy or hard copy or audio book coming along. But please have a look, because something about hard copy is really nice, and I will make mention of that again as well. So pulled out some statements. This was a very interesting response to lockdown and isolation. A woman who had an extended family and children and grandchildren ending up in a condominium by herself. And what she did, it was decide her doing was to recreate in as much detail as she could the village she grew up in Myanmar from recycled materials. And she spent a lot of time researching it and looking back at photos and talking to people online about the village and recapturing those stories. And that inspired her. And as she said, building my village has given me a renewed sense of purpose. And and she says here, that got me through lockdown in pretty good state of mental health. So interesting. I also have read recently, some of you might be better on the neuroscience, but I was reading something by a neuroscientist who said that the time in our lives when we have the most dopamine in our brains is between 7 and 29. So after that, it's all downhill. So years for me. But seriously, and his recommendation is that if we go back and revisit activities and occupations and experiences from that period of our time, we get dopamine by association. So I'm just wondering if, as well as the levels of meaning for this woman, that there wasn't this advantage of increased dopamine levels. How can we know? Ben, this is one of my personal favorite stories and inclusions. So Ben says, this is Ben speaking, I can't write, so I'm telling my dad, and he's writing it down. And he goes on to tell his story about what it was like to be also experiencing lockdowns and to be a vulnerable person. And that first up, he needed to have his jabs to feel safe. So that was the most important thing he had to do, was get his jabs. And then after that, he does talk about time being a bit of a sea. There was all this time and not so much to do in that sea of time. And I think that was such an issue for so many people and caused so much stress and dislocation. But he talks about his collection of Matchbox cars there and getting out and doing things like one of the places that was still open was cemeteries. So he was going for walks through cemeteries, trying to read and understand the gravestones. And who would have thought of that? But that was part of his story and his response. Interestingly, this person, so as a woman, decided living in a property in a bushfire-affected town in Western Australia, says, the most rewarding thing I've ever done was to become a volunteer firefighter during a time when we were very much affected by the bushfires. So her story is, that's what she said, fires, I've come out fighting. And again, the agency of that response. And she talks about how hard that was, how much physical strength you need to hold one of those massive hoses, to be able to load the trucks up, to be there working to shoulder with mostly men who are strong farmers, and what that meant to her. But again, one of the most meaningful things that she'd ever been through. On a very prosaic level, I don't know how many of you got into your veggie garden or interacting with plants a little bit more during lockdown. I know that indoor plants became very much more popular. But here's someone who said, it was easy to get down during COVID. So we asked ourselves, what can we do? I'm just highlighting here that people spoke about doing a lot. So I'm trying to pull that language out for you. And this was about several things, I think. Doing something that was tangible, literally getting your hands in the earth. And again, I think that was probably assuaging some of the anxiety that went with being locked down, but also having a tangible end product. So they said it got harder and harder to go shopping. I don't know about here, but getting to the stores was to buy groceries got pretty challenging at one stage. And so just to be able to have your own vegetables and herbs in the garden really meant a lot. And to this person, as I said, they were the original brown finger. They'd never really grown anything successfully in their life, but went through this, and now it's their new occupation, which was gardening. So this is a very everyday response, but again, this innate knowing about doing. Then we got on to the doing with. So a lot of this is about how people sought connection during COVID in various forms. So we all know that we were there able to connect with people, Zooming with, families overseas. I know I was. And that craving to be doing with, but also in response to the more of the crisis situations. This is a good one. It was stinky, it was hard, but feeling the sense of closeness, of community, and working with strangers from all walks of life and unity of service. So, we all tend to get into our grooves in life. We hang out with people we know who are usually pretty like us, right? And do the same things, have the same values. What this person is saying is that actually that wasn't the case. We all came together from very different backgrounds to have a common purpose in what we were doing, which was to clean up our city, which had been badly flooded and was stinky and horrible. But it gave us this sense of being rewarding in its own right to do that and to be shoulder to shoulder. And camaraderie. Just a heartwarming story of a family, all of whom played a musical instrument in the household, who were very active in their local church and would normally be the people supporting the service and the music through playing instruments, unable to do that. So what they did, they set themselves a goal of learning a new piece of music together as a family and then live streaming it to their church on Sundays. So, and they named this story, jamming the lockdown themselves. So again, a lot happening there. Do you play cricket here? No.
Baseball.
Mary Beth knows what cricket is, right? It's very popular in Australia because of our English heritage, and it's something that you'll see in summertime, people playing in parks around Australia and in fields, and then more formally. So it's most people grow up being exposed to cricket, and I had two brothers who were kind of cricket and football mad, so it was a game that's also pretty close to my heart. In this community, we had a badly drought affected group of farmers. Now, I just have to stress, this was so bad that people were walking away from their farms that had been in their families for 4 or 5 generations. They lost everything. And they had to pack up and walk away, and the bank then took them. I know you have that history in this country too, but really hard. And the harder it was, in a way, the more isolated they got from each other. So Kieran Kelly, one of the leaders in his community, said, look, you know what, let's get together and have a game of cricket. And the most recent photo is not here. There's a picture of all these, you would call them pickups, we call them utes, parked in a circle in red dust that was previously a green field. And they have this full-on game of cricket, as he says in the story. It wasn't just because we were having hard times, doesn't mean that we were going to go easy on each other. They were super competitive. But then the community they came together, local businesses donated drinks and sausages. They had a sausage sizzle, and they came together, and that was their way of really responding to the hardest of times they'd ever have. And for that time, transcending them. Transcendence is also a really important function of some occupations, and maybe we'll talk about that later. Finally, doing 4. This is where people came together to do something important, and I'm just going to highlight a couple because they're pretty full on. This story, and I was so excited that we had this submitted to us, is a story about a filmmaker, a documentary maker, who worked together with his community of Conjola, who, I got to tell you, their town was erased. It was flattened by the fire. It was a terrible situation. And he said that the response there, and I think this is a really interesting quote, is that art's a wound turned into light. And he worked with his community and said, you tell the story in the way that you want to tell the story about the fire. And they've gone on to win awards in New York, LA, and in Edmonton. and it's been nominated for the best film and best director in Australia. So really powerful for them, really powerful for that community, but powerful for this to have been included in the book. And just pulled out a quote from the director who said that the people of Conjola were brave, they wanted their voices heard, and from the obvious questions of climate change and Indigenous land management, it's a bit of an issue in Australia. Indigenous people used to burn the bush routinely to prevent big fires coming, and we stopped doing that, and it seems like we're paying a price for that. It's a whole other story, but that's one of the issues there. And that there were failures of our emergency services. This has also been the topic of inquiries in Australia at the moment. The firefighting services didn't turn up, or they turned up inadequately, which did contribute to the destruction of property and life. But he says the film puts the viewer in the line of fire and asks, what would you do in this situation? Very moving. You can stream this free, I believe, on Hiveo. It's not a platform I know, but have a look. Who knows, by now someone might have put it up on YouTube. That's what happens, right? Okay, very quickly now, I just want to speak to another couple here that, and I just want to pull out, there's two narratives here that are from health professionals because they responded to, and whilst I didn't want them to be the majority of narrations, it was great to see that health professionals felt that they had something to offer and that they're doing. But this was from a professor of nursing who said basically what was noteworthy or important is that the most marginal people with the least resources fared the worst. They lost most. So in these low plain areas that were affected by floods, which was the cheapest housing that then couldn't be insured because people can't afford the insurance premiums, these are the people that lost everything. So the people with the least lost the most. Not a level playing field. Okay, so, and he said, I was really proud to be part of this caring community, other health professionals and volunteers, but I didn't do anything very high tech or magical, but it was about the being with that was so important. Similarly, an occupational therapist ends up here with a group of donkeys. I don't know, what's the collective noun for donkeys? Herd? Don't know. Bray of donkeys. So she ends up, this occupational therapist ends up with these donkeys that arrived during COVID and decides that she's going to bring them into her therapy program for children as animal-assisted therapy. And she saw that as, I don't know how she trained them or how she trained them, but apparently, according to her narrative, donkeys are special. I don't know. Are they? Who knows? But she seems to think that donkeys have a particular way with children. But she then said this was a good antidote, particularly to lockdown when there'd been so much on-screen time for children, that this connecting with the donkeys and to farming. Her occupational therapy practice is on a huge, big farm. So I think that's a really interesting story. And another one of my absolute favourites, when this one came in, I said, despite the double-blind reviewing, we have to have this story. Not that I wasn't objective, but from Peyton Armistead, age 9. And we've included her actual written story there. And I said to the graphic designer, we've got to make a way to get what she actually wrote. Because apparently when she heard her mum talking to her auntie about this book that the occupational therapists were doing about how people responded, she said, I want to write a story about what we went through in the bushfires and what I noticed. And her story is about being very scared, and they were very close to fire came very close to their property. But as she says, what I noticed was that people helped each other, and that made me feel better and a whole lot less scared. wanted to highlight this story, and I won't go into it too much, but this was a community pantry that was set up by Rotary. I know you have Rotary Club here, for farmers who were drought affected, who were struggling. Some of them, word got out, they weren't eating, but were too proud to ask for assistance or to receive assistance. So they set up a pantry, but it was connected to a coffee and tea place and a library. So you could kind of come along and have a cup of tea and a chat and maybe get a book. And while you were there, you might just get some of the bags of rice that were going. You weren't actually there getting help. And that some of the farmers came in and actually wanted to donate whatever they had, so that their sense of was not wanting to be helped but contributing, even though it was so tough for them and they had almost nothing. And as this person says, one woman brought in a couple of buckets of cucumbers and said, well, I might get some flour from you if that's okay, but I bought some cucumbers. So there was a sense in which that was empowering for people who were really doing it tough at that time. And they called that Farmer Joe's Pantry. Finally, the anchor story was Uncle Albert. And he's, as he said, I'm a proud Yorta man. That's one of the tribal groups in Victoria. And his story we made last because it picked up a couple of threads. But he talks about his role as an elder and what it meant to go through, to be a firefighter, and then also to get through COVID. I do want to make mention of representation here, because we, having asked people how they wanted themselves represented and what images they wanted to use, he was very clear that along with Kerry, who was our Indigenous representative on the committee, not the same tribal group, but connected through their networks, that he was wearing his possum skin cloak. What's a possum skin cloak? It's something that traditionally Aboriginal people wore as a mark of being an elder, and then was probably stamped out, disallowed or forbidden by the colonial powers. So there's been a resurgence of Aboriginal people making possum skin cloaks again as a way of reclaiming identity and tradition and culture. And the doing of making those cloaks has been very important, and a kind of we're back and we're claiming that identity again. And I'm going to talk a bit more about Uncle Albert in a minute, but I just want to get to what the stories have told us. Now, can I suggest that this is all public domain narrative data? So some enterprising graduate students could come in and analyse this narrative data. It's there, and I really hope that people do that. My take on it, in a not in-depth way so far, is that the narratives speak to doing as an inherent way of knowing. They didn't need occupational therapists to tell them what to do. People knew what to do. They came up with these occupational solutions and strategies themselves. Doing provided purpose, structure, temporal location, and temporal differentiation. Very important when people were feeling disoriented, particularly during the lockdowns. Doing was therapeutic, straight up therapeutic, and really assuaged a lot of anxieties that people had. Doing with gave opportunities to connect with others creatively, productively, and in ways that were healing. Doing with was fun, it was transcendent as well as being productive. And doing for allowed people to serve that bigger purpose than their own needs. And I think we don't address that enough in occupational therapy. People would rather be providing a service to others and being a recipient of service. So we have to remember that it's important to create opportunities in which people we would work with also are serving others as citizens. And caring for their environment, there were quite a few regeneration projects in the book, and caring for their community. There were some unexpected outcomes. feedback from contributors has been powerful. We've heard back from people, for example, I heard a story that Ben now goes around saying to people, I'm in this book, my story's in here, you can read it. And that another one of the contributors wrote to us and said, this has assisted me to come out of a very deep depression because someone thought that I'm valid. That's the word you use, that I'm valid enough to have my story told and shown. And that the other thing that happened is that we've had down here, Uncle Albert has really embraced this project and his interaction with us. He's gone on to have an advisory capacity to Occupational Therapy Australia. And here's the really cool bit at conferences. If he's there, he signs the book. He's the book signer, which I really like because it could have been the president. Maybe they might have asked me, really? Is it that interesting? Uncle Baxter feels that Uncle Albert Baxter feels that sense of ownership and representation. So he signs the book. People line up and they're buying the books at conference and he's there going, yes, and what's your name again? How good's that? It's his book. It's all their book. And that's the point. It's their book, not ours. So all up, we're using this book with politicians. It's now being spoken about in terms of our work with NGOs, with service providers, with people in policy roles and with government, saying this is what we're about, this is our domain of concern, and that it might also then inform education and research. I'm on the homeward stretch here, so I don't have a lot of time to unpack it, but what this project reflects about occupational therapy and occupational science is something I think really important. And overall, it's the message that working synergistically enables us to achieve more significant outcomes. So at the heart of this slide is the notion that occupational science is the knowing that occupation is a complex and situated phenomenon, and the research corpus that underpins that, and the work of so many scholars that have contributed to that, many of whom are in this room and some online. Working in conjunction with occupational therapy, which is the know-how to enable occupation in diverse contexts using occupational strategies where possible. So there we are, an important relationship informed by diverse knowledge traditions and epistemologies. Also, discourses, ideologies, and theories and movements across now what would be 2 centuries if we think about where occupational therapy began. Also, as I said this morning, always influenced by international and national social, political, and economic drivers and local drivers. But this is what's happening, and this is what can happen when we work together synergistically. As we're speaking back to those contextual drivers, we are also now in the engine room of shaping those in a powerful way, and there's more to come. This morning I spoke about representation and politicisation of our efforts. We are informed in both occupational science and occupational therapy by multiple discourses and knowledge traditions. And we can respond to these drivers, advancing a justice of participation. The example for me is, and I'm not sure where your association is at in America, but I know that you do have levels of representation. But in the last year alone, Occupational Therapy Australia has made 44 submissions to Senate hearings, federal inquiries, standing committees on issues from mental health service provision, aged care classification, disability, veterans' rights, home-based services for people with chronic conditions. Also, treatment of asylum seekers. I was involved in that one. One of the senators said, who read the position statement on occupational deprivation, this is really a very important concept. I haven't heard of it before, but it's really important and should be informing what we're doing going forward in the way we deal with asylum seekers in Australia. All this is occupational science and occupational therapy together. Oops, okay. So what's happening in the future. I think that if I pull all this together, it's about what I call now Occupational Justice Plus, and I'm more and more convinced that this is the way we need to think about what we're doing and represent it. So we bring together not just ways of doing and opportunities for doing, but that needs to sit alongside ways of knowing, which is epistemic justice, alongside, again, hermeneutic justice, which is ways of being, and really importantly, ways of being represented, which represents people's ontological standpoint. So here we have these sitting together as a way of working with, rather than ever doing to, or thinking that if we just stand in the pillar of occupational justice alone, that we know what it is that people need to do. We don't. We need to stand alongside people working from their own knowledge traditions. And in the book, these knowledge traditions, these epistemologies are represented. Indigenous epistemologies, gendered epistemologies, they're there and they're being highlighted and respected in their own right alongside the doing. And then, importantly, the representation. People had ownership over how they chose to be represented. To me, Occupational Justice Plus is the way that we go forward together. So, in closing, I think we're in a collective moment right now around the globe, and it's a really important collective moment historically when we have confronted many of the structural inequalities that became so evident to us during the pandemic. Through the challenging times in which we in the occupational disciplines have the ability to realise in a powerful way our social contract, our social mandate. But as the African proverb goes, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. And so, in summary then, I think that in working together, occupational scientists, occupational therapists, in all roles, in all settings, none is better than the other. I really want to stress that. With people, it's always with, from diverse backgrounds, needs, identities, aspirations, knowledge traditions, as self-defining, self-determining citizens, it seems entirely possible that together we really can go further. Thank you.
So we can open up for questions to start us off. Go ahead,
I
Ryan.
always have a question. My question, I
Can you
think
really speak up because it's just a little hard to hear with
Sure.
the masks on for me.
yeah, well, I can stop for a second. So it's really interesting. I think we in the US a little bit in our practice have been enamored with the ADLs, the bathroom and the, getting dressed and those sorts of things. And you so wonderfully through this book have shown the scope of occupation being so much more broad than that. But I just wonder where you saw that in these stories, or if that did sort of emerge of those sort of everyday mundane things that might not have been sort of these moments of doing, but still very much part of the everyday, or if you sort of saw that theme emerge at all.
So did we see, so in the stories that we got, were they about ADL stuff? Like, you mean baking or self-care?
Yeah, I mean, I just wonder because that's how often we talk about OT when we explain it to people, and just like the so maybe that's the core here. But just to see a book being used so effectively to show that it's more than that, it's beyond that, it's just really telling to me and powerful.
Sure. Oh boy, I'm just going to go a little controversial here. What the hell? People expect it. I'm Australian, right? I think that's actually Dr. Wilcock called it a rut, the rut of ADLs, that we're a bit stuck there. And is it a need to be needed thing? I don't know. But you know what? People didn't talk about that. I think that there's a level of just functionally doing it in whatever way you can. And what I've always seen in the narrative stuff that I've done, people can choose to have assistance if that means they have more time to do other things that are meaningful. I think we're more stuck on ADL and independence than other people are. I think independence is, if you unpack it, it's a construct with its own history, probably Western philosophy that's in behind that. And I just don't see that it didn't emerge in every story that every person sent us from around Australia, that was important to them. But what really was important was the doing stuff that was meaningful for them, that helped them respond to, you know, what was going on, whether it was a bushfire, flood, drought, or COVID. And also the doing with and doing for was far more important. I don't think people gave a damn, actually, if they didn't shower for a week when they were working together to get rid of the clean up after the flood or bushfire. People ate whatever they could. We saw that it just kind of didn't matter. But the doing with and doing for was what they were telling us. And yeah, as I said, there was this consistency about those narratives. Sure, it bears more inquiry, I think, but you know, if we're really going to listen to people, they didn't tell us that was important, and I think it's time for us to get over that a bit.
Thank you.
Yep, it's a bit of a revolution. I call it the walking out of the bathroom revolution.
I love it.
What did Barack Obama say? You know, it's time to get your bedroom slippers off and put your marching boots on. Something about that forward momentum. I think we can really springboard off from projects like this that are, again, it's about showing, not telling. If I ever hear a description where someone talks about ADLs, I just go cold. And it's better with the definition of occupational therapy being about working with people to ensure that they can do what they need and want to do in their lives. No mention of ADL.
So I have in the chat, a comment from our dear colleague, Jenny Womack. And she says, thank you, Dr. Whiteford. I'm very interested in concepts of caring and caregiving and was struck by how many times in the stories you shared, people mentioned caring communities and caring for. I realize the analysis isn't complete, but you have some initial thoughts about the ways in which caring was narrated and whether, if you were hearing something new in those descriptions.
That's a really good question. I think that there is really something here about this. And what I said before about we need to be very mindful of the fact that by and large, people don't see themselves as service recipients for whatever happens in their life, whether it's because they end up in a refugee camp or because they're in an aged care facility. That was usually not the identity that people aspired to in their lives occupationally. So the motivation, and some of the people that were volunteering and working with and for others had real challenges to do that, but that was superordinate to them. And they saw that what was most meaningful for them and their identity was to be a doing for and doing with person. So I think we could do a lot more with that. And I think that the frame of them being as citizens. So we remember that flood story? We were people living together as citizens in this town, cleaning it up together, shoulder to shoulder from every walk of life. If we frame people that we work with as citizens who have identities, rights, and responsibilities, it makes the work we're doing a bit different. I think so. Very good question. Yes, I think this speaks powerfully to that. Absolutely. And exchange. And so I'll just pick up that element about the farmer who comes in with her buckets of cucumbers. Okay, I need stuff. I need food. I need flour. I need rice. But I've got whatever I brought to hand, which is some scruffy cucumbers in a couple of buckets, but I'm bringing something, I'm contributing. And that's important too. Let's give people an opportunity to contribute.
Questions from the audience?
Yeah.
So this isn't really a question. I just wanted to comment that I love the terminology you used of social contract. I know it was like you had this whole presentation and I picked out this one thing, but I mean, it was all wonderful and I can't wait to look at this book, but that term of social contract, I think, is such an important concept for us to unpack over and over and over again, and to really think about what our responsibilities are and how it is that we, if we're going to say we're occupational therapists and that we're going to work with people to do it, like we're putting ourselves in a place of obligation where we need to use what we know and what we have to do those things. And I think sometimes we get lost in the minutia of like day-to-day practice and forget that we have this larger sort of societal obligation that for some people is enacted, on a one-to-one basis by honoring that person for who they are and, I'm not saying that's not important, but also just to be able to, I just have so many thoughts about what those two words together, could really mean for us. And I'm going to stop now because
If you think about our raison d'etre as being about having a social contract and being essentially having essentially a socially transformative role, that predicates a whole different way of thinking about what we're doing and where we're doing it and who we're actually serving and what interests and discourses we're serving. Okay, we're going into another hour of discussion on that one. But,
I'm going to have to think on this for a while. And
We have time for one more question. This is from Amanda Carroll, who's a graduate of our program in Montana. This was wonderful. Thank you. Did any of the individuals who contributed stories reflect and then go on to take any action in their communities because of participating in this project?
As far as we've followed up, there have been some spin-offs from people knowing about the project. So I think that there's one here about where after the bushfire, people who were metal workers got together and they recreated a gum tree with gum leaves that people could inscribe something on. And out of that came the community came together, but I think now they've got a side project running around that, but a whole lot of people who had never done anything like that with their hands or had ever been crafters. So it seems that there've been spin-offs. Again, it's just feedback that we're getting from different people, but the momentum at the stuff that was the doing with and for has, as we understand it, continued. So that's why we're trying to get this out there to NGOs and service providers to really help inform how they might be reaching out to these communities. So it's interesting. I would say this has sparked a bit of a deprofessionalized move where, let's face it, people did amazing stuff and knew what to do and how to do it without an occupational therapist in sight. And we're the experts on doing, right? Wow, there's a whole lot of innate knowing. And I think about, again, epistemologies and knowledge traditions, there's a whole lot of knowing that there's rich veins of it. And have we played our role in maybe not allowing those to be foregrounded and to be as strong as they might? I'm really throwing out some curly challenges for us here tonight. I do want to close by saying that Occupational Therapy Australia very generously have authorised me to share the IP on this book. So I have a big file full of all the processes that we went through, and they've said that they are willing to share that. If there are any countries that want to do a similar project, that they would be happy to collaborate and share everything that we learned, which would be a huge cost saving, because that was probably the first 6 months of this book, and my life was going with that stuff. So that's very generous for them, and that's that spirit of going forward together.
Well, let's give Dr. Whiteford We've just been so delighted that you're finally able to come to North Carolina and spend a couple days with us. And I picked up Dr. Whiteford and her husband from the airport, and they've been traveling for a while, and they had these little tiny suitcases. So I thought, in terms of a gift, I didn't want to give you something. So we have a couple little things, to help you remember your visit here.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Cheers, everyone.
Yeah, we'll save a little time for people to get a chance to look at this beautiful book. I just want to say a quick thank you to Sue Coppola, Sayoko Kawabata, and Rachel Vaughn for their amazing help in getting this all together for this event. We've done a lot of planning, and we're very thankful for all you've done. Here's the link to the survey. So those of you who are online can grab that. And Mary Catherine, I'm wondering if you could put that in the chat real fast? That would be great. And those of you who are here, yes, take your pictures and you can get your certificate of attendance. That's so you complete the little survey and then you'll get a certificate of attendance. And then, this is made possible by our generous donations. So if you would like to make a gift, you can find that on our website, on the division's website, and the link is here as well.
Can I just ask that, is that link really donate ? From, or is it form?
I think it's from,
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah. But again, you can just go to our division website and there's a little link that says gift. So you can find it.
There you go.
Yeah. And so I hope that those of you online enjoyed the evening. And if you have any questions and are still needing the link at the end, you can always email me. And those of you who are here, I hope you'll join us in the atrium for some further conversation with Gail. I'm sure she would be delighted to chat more about what's going on, what thoughts you're having.
I'll bring the book to reception if you want to.
Awesome. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Good. Are you good?
Yeah, yes.
Awesome.